The historian Margaret Macmillan has studied global crises through the ages, and two of her conclusions for leaders are: one, invest all the resources you can in figuring out what you're up against, and two, don't assume that once you've weathered the storm, things will go back to what they were. Those two observations are the basis of our conference this morning. How is the world likely to change with the virus? What are we learning about how to live for Jesus now? What should we be paying human attention to as we seek divine guidance? After each speaker, we'll break out into digital rooms for 15 minutes to discuss questions arising from each talk. These rooms are assigned randomly. So if you land in a room you don't fancy, honestly, we're not persecuting you. There is a chat facility on Zoom, and you're welcome to place comments or questions there. And at the end, there will be a short time for a few of these questions to be asked of Madeleine and Ruth, which Jenny and I will select. And then Bishop James will conclude our conference around about 11:30 or a bit after. So I think I've said all that I need to say at this point, and I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker this morning, who is Dr. Madeleine Pennington, Head of Research at Theos. Welcome to Madeleine.
I think. Am I now? Can everyone hear me? I'm sort of seeing nods. I think I was muted before. Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you all, even virtually. But I guess we're getting more used to virtual feeling like really being with each other now. So I was asked to reflect on the social, cultural and political changes that we might expect in the wake of the pandemic. And in doing so, I'm mindful of that classic advice that it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. So I think, obviously, it's difficult enough to understand even what is happening right now. Something so straightforward as even how many people have sadly already died from coronavirus is actually really, we've all found, is actually really difficult to pin down. So never mind to know what will happen next. Simon mentioned being imaginative, and I think this is about training our imaginations to look forward. On March the 16th, which is almost exactly 3 months ago today, I started my own personal journal of the pandemic, which described an out of control situation in Italy. At that time, they'd had about 2,000 deaths. 369 deaths in one day, I reflected in horror. And I wrote that it was the first day for me that I'd felt it was going to be bad here too. It was starting to look bad for us. And we had lost 55 people at the time. I couldn't really have imagined at all that our death toll would be 42,000 by June. It's just so very difficult to imagine the future different from what we know. And of course, what happens next will depend on all sorts of variables: how long restrictions are in place, the final death toll, the extent of economic damage, when and actually if we find a vaccine, and even how our politicians react. As we've seen with the Dominic Cummings scandal and the Black Lives Matter protests, the national conversation can also change suddenly in ways which are almost entirely unpredictable. So I'm not going to try and offer one prediction, but I will offer a range of possibilities around 5 key themes, and that is climate change, geopolitics, our internal political culture, economic restructuring, and the big existential questions. It seems right to finish on those. So first then, climate change. And I won't dwell on this because I know it's Ruth's area, but I wanted to say that this was surely the biggest issue facing our society before the pandemic. And I think that will remain the case after or if the virus is controlled. We have a very limited time to respond to that, of course. And the extent to which the pandemic has served or will serve as a distraction, or more positively jolts us into action, will direct everything else. Perhaps I was not the only one left bemused by predictions that it would take years before the aviation industry went back to normal, as if those years were years that we had to spare, or as if we even wanted things to go back to normal in that area. It's predicted that global carbon emissions will be down about 7% this year because of the pandemic, but that is still a long way short of the net zero target. More positively, in recent polling commissioned by Sky News, 33% of people thought that climate change was the biggest issue that the world needed to address, and that was the most popular answer, in fact. 37% actually also said that they would stop taking holidays abroad. So there are some promising signs there, but the scale of the challenge really is enormous. So that's my first theme. Secondly, the wider geopolitical situation. Of course, the end of the Brexit transition period is moving ever closer, but our capacity to formulate positive forward steps has been significantly restricted by coronavirus. To offer a personal example, my husband is actually a civil servant and was working on a Brexit-related project until April, when he was moved instead to work on COVID. Now, his previous area of planning hasn't stopped, but it's now being handled by a reduced team. I think something that's often missed when in the news is that neither the government nor the civil service actually have endless intellectual capacity, that there are limited numbers of people working on these things. And while solutions are still needed, far fewer people are now working to find them. At the same time, devolution has drastically and perhaps unintentionally accelerated within the UK. Nicola Sturgeon has come out of the crisis far better than Boris Johnson in the polls, which of course strengthens the cause of Scottish independence. Support for Welsh independence is actually also now at a record high, so the union is looking a bit precarious. Meanwhile, of course, the EU faces pandemic challenges of its own, so the speed with which internal borders were closed plays into the hands of Eurosceptics, and there will obviously be more potential friction ahead if Euro countries recover at different speeds from the economic shock. France and Germany did actually recently announce their joint support for a €500 billion recovery fund, which obviously points to there being some political will there. But securing consent from all of the EU nations obviously remains a bit of an uphill struggle. That said, I think it's perhaps America that we should be watching most closely if we're thinking about geopolitics. Trump's handling of the crisis obviously has further damaged an already fractious relationship with China. But China actually holds far more of the economic cards here, not least because we've essentially in the West exported our manufacturing industry there. So America's position as a global power is fragile. And while Trump's recent performance has made his otherwise quite possible November re-election less likely, he still enjoys what is a natural political advantage of being an incumbent. So as we in the UK tie our political destiny closer to the States, I think the big picture in all of this is surely that the UK and its main allies are actually quite unlikely to fare well in the pandemic. I should have said actually, when I've been thinking about these 5 themes, I realised what I've actually come up with is a roster of all the ways in which the world is looking likely to get worse. And I'm sorry if this is all a bit depressing, but maybe there will be hope there at the end as well. And of course, the ill health of American society, sticking with America for a while, has been underlined by the death of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests. And this has precipitated, obviously, an unexpected moment of reckoning with structural racism across the globe. Nonetheless, the more negative reactions to those protests themselves demonstrates how deeply embedded the divides within our own society, politically, culturally, still are. So my third theme is our internal political climate. The philosopher James Mumford had a great recent book out on this called Vexed, and he argued that our whole political climate has been increasingly and unhelpfully divided into package deals. So basically, if I think X, I'm almost certainly also going to think Y and Z, even if Y and Z are completely inconsistent with one another, because what I'm doing there is I'm signaling my belonging to a certain in-group. And our whole political climate has basically been divided into two almost irreconcilable political tribes, which are the vehicles of almost all of our political discourse. Obviously, Leave and Remain identities have entrenched that, but it's bigger than Brexit. And I do think that it's a much overused term, culture war, but I think we do need to recognise that there is a culture war ongoing. And additionally to that, that it will be increasingly difficult to ignore. Obviously, the pandemic had seemed to interrupt all of that to an extent. Thinking about the impact of coronavirus here, for a moment it seemed like it could even be the route to some kind of national reconciliation. But of course, recent events and further back, the contrasting reactions to the Dominic Cummings crisis show that those deep fractures really haven't just gone away. On the contrary, in fact, I think by spending more time online, most of us are now more exposed to the echo chambers, algorithms, and fake news, which so effectively drew up those battle lines in the first place. One of Theos's ongoing research projects is looking at social cohesion. And here we're finding that Brexit tribalism dominates our virtual and conceptual communities, so social media, politics, communities of interest, far more than our physical and local communities, which are shaped by in-person interactions and provision of local services, that kind of thing. In our data gathering last year, we went actually to some of the most troubled places in the country, but asked our participants, is your area moving closer together or further apart? And this was right in the fray of all of that Brexit, sort of really the kind of low ebb of toxicity, I'd say. But only a quarter of participants actually answered further apart. And I think in the wake of our pandemic, we're likely to see some of those online adjustments we've had to make made permanent, more remote working, more time online, and that may well bolster some of the more divisive aspects of our political life. At the same time, of course, we've seen many physical meeting places closing, and a lot will depend on how many of those places are able to reopen as points of social healing. On the other hand, initiatives like Clap for Carers have obviously encouraged a more positive national spirit. I think Whisper It even brought us closer together to our actual neighbours. So I think on balance, the early phase of the pandemic potentially aided social cohesion. But that shared sense of a shared experience and an increased social solidarity, I think is wavering dramatically. And the less that social solidarity is maintained over the course of the pandemic, the less likely we are to see political healing. If what now follows is a long period of rule bending and rule breaking, the frustrations of a nation in grief, steadily lowered morale, divisive culture wars, an economy ripped apart, and then after all that, a hard end to the Brexit transition period, we are not going to emerge from the crisis a happier or more unified nation on our own. At the same time, the pandemic has also made us much more comfortable with the idea of policing our neighbours' behaviour. In fact, much more comfortable with the idea of the police policing our neighbours' behaviour. And that feels sensible right now. I think most people are in favour of that. But just a few months ago, that would have seemed absurd. It would have been unimaginable that the police would have that control. And given that we entered that period on the back of a period of almost unprecedented social liberalism, I think any kind of move towards the sort of authoritarian end of that scale could be one of the more long-lasting effects of the lockdown. Particularly if that is bolstered by a backlash against liberal values in other areas. Obviously, at the very least, we all now have a much keener sense of health as a common good within this. What I do demonstrably affects the well-being of other people around me. And the huge outpouring of love for the NHS is also reflective of a growing communitarian outlook as opposed to individualism. And I want to use that as a pivot to think about economic restructuring, number 4, because despite that outpouring of affection for our health system, the future really doesn't look very bright for public services. With rising unemployment, lower tax income, and a right-leaning government, it's almost inevitable that the next few years will see reduced public spending on frontline services. And of course, that isn't just about the NHS. I think it's particularly worth noting actually the plight of councils here. Many of them, I think, about 20 have said that they're on the brink of bankruptcy because of coronavirus, and that is going to, it's really on a knife edge there. Of course, I don't need to tell this audience that the churches have played an indispensable role in service delivery through an age of austerity, and I think that is something which really will become more pressing in future, but of course with limited resources, so that is difficult. On an individual level too, we face huge rises in personal debt. So the charity Step Change estimates that 4.6 million people have amassed £6.1 billion more household debt over the course of the pandemic, and 2.6 million people have fallen into arrears. Now that figure is obviously likely to increase and will leave its own legacy, but the hardship isn't being distributed equally. Not only has the disease itself disproportionately affected the elderly, ethnic minorities, those with underlying health conditions, so too the economic lockdown has affected those in practical and service industries and small businesses the hardest. Of course, when on the 11th of May, Boris Johnson said, "Get back to work," if you can't work from home, it was not middle-class think tank researchers that were going to bear the brunt of that risk, and nor is it the middle classes who will bear the harshest burden in the economic storms ahead. It's also worth saying that although the elderly have been hit hardest by the virus, obviously one thing we saw after 2008 was people just entering the job market really, really badly hit. So I think the youth are going to be particularly feeling that. So there's going to be a further stretching out of our economy. And in fact, Theos has published a report just last week talking about what the church can do around inequality. I think we already have one of the highest levels of income inequality in Europe. And as that increases, there will be more that the church can be doing, I think, to tackle that. It's one of our ongoing streams, so maybe watch this space. So the pandemic will stretch rich and poor further apart, but depending on how long it lasts, we're also likely to see qualitative restructuring of the economy too. The transformation in the working world was in motion long before coronavirus. The increased automation of jobs, the rise of the gig economy, the increasing reliance on technology in the workplace is all now set to accelerate. And perhaps most striking of all, as people realise that they can now work effectively from home, the premium that comes from living in a city centre will drop. So I think one thing is quite likely, we will probably see an escape to the country, or at least a further bloating of the commuter belt on a much larger scale in the months and years ahead of us. Of course, if city centres do hollow out, that brings its own effects as well. So this will probably change the political and cultural balance of urban and rural areas, most likely cause a swing to the left probably, particularly around the rural southeast or semi-rural. And an even starker division between ethnically diverse cities and less diverse rural communities. Now, on many of these points, obviously the pandemic has unveiled the ways in which our society is just not really working for many people at the moment. But ironically, those most affected by the virus are those who were often doing worse before. It has basically brought unfairness and complacency around unfairness into sharper focus. So my final theme then is existential reevaluation, because this does all amount to an existential challenge. So this is theme 5. This is my visual aid, is my hand, because I don't have a PowerPoint. So how are our values, meaning making, and even spiritual lives actually changing despite this? I think perhaps Ruth will speak on this too, but again, it seemed remiss to omit it. So again, I'll be very brief. But Theos was really interested to see the Tearfund polling from the start of May, thank you Ruth, which found that 1 in 20 Brits had started praying during the crisis. We've just been doing some polling as well. It's as yet unpublished, so this is a sneak peek. But we found similar numbers of people starting to meditate, spend time in quiet reflection, a slightly lower figure on prayer itself, but still those positive signs. But the data also shows similar numbers of people stopping praying. And so I think we do need to exercise caution in predicting some kind of wholesale revolution. In fact, there are certainly openings, but I think at the moment they are just openings. And we've already found that nearly 1 in 3 people have been thinking more about what makes life meaningful since the start of the pandemic. 14% have felt the need for more wisdom or guidance. Meanwhile, recent polling commissioned by the All Churches Trust asked members of the public to identify what they thought would be the most important role of the church after the pandemic. And providing a space to remember the dead was identified net as the most important. This was closely followed by providing a quiet space to reflect. I think what all of this implies, more than a noisy revival, is a sort of a period of quiet grappling going on at the moment, with change and with loss. And that's hardly surprising, given how overstimulating and confusing most of this has been for us all. Simon said, it's okay to be confused, and I think we are all experiencing that, and people who are not in church contexts will be experiencing that exactly the same way. So those are my 5 themes, which is climate change, geopolitics, internal political culture, the economy, and existential questions. Taking a step back, I think the patterns I've explored today reflect a strange mix of widespread distraction from what matters and yet unexpected clarity around the true state of things. So we're distracted from climate change, we're distracted from Brexit, we're distracted from what we need to do about Brexit, and we're distracted from those deep scars across our social fabric. These are all things that we really need to reckon with urgently. It's a problem to be distracted. But we're also more aware than ever of the extent of racial injustice, of economic inequality, of the changing world of work. It is a period of unveiling. And I think in this, the church will be needed to meet people in their crises. It will be needed as we continue to live more of our lives online, and yet are paradoxically far more tied to our local communities than ever before. Maybe not ever before, actually, but in recent years. As our public services are again at risk, it will be needed. And it will be needed as we try to come to terms with our losses. Because I think what the All Churches Trust data shows is that the general public understand, even if it's not always reflected in church attendance, that the church can be there for them as they remember what they have lost. I think that is really important. It's not just about grief, it's a general sort of accompaniment. So that's what I think. I think that sense of loss is really important. I think probably Ruth is going to explore, hopefully, as they look forward to what will continue, what is sustainable, and maybe what is being built anew as well. So maybe there's hope in there, but I'm not sure that I have offered any. So that's my thoughts anyway.
Madeleine, thanks ever so much for that. I mean, basically, I asked you to diagnose the world inside 20 minutes, so you made a really good stab at an impossible task and gave us 5 key areas to think about. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much. I guess one of the things we're going to get asked is, have you got kind of full enough notes to be able to share with us subsequently?
Yeah, I can, of course.
That would be great, because I think actually that there are participants here. I've been scribbling away and I can never recognise my own handwriting, and there must be others too. And in fact, I've just received a note saying, can we have the notes? We will get them. Thank you ever so much for that.
I should have said that right at the start, really, shouldn't I? And I say,
no, that's fine.
But just keep you on the edge all the way through the talk.
It keeps us engaged, absolutely. So what we're going to do now then is to move into our algorithmically defined breakout rooms. Okay, it's not our fault. And Madeleine has left us with a couple of questions, which she's alluded to already. And these are now hopefully on your screen. What has the COVID-19 pandemic obscured, distracted us from, prevented us from tackling in our society? And then secondly, what has the COVID-19 pandemic unveiled in our society? So, I mean, take your time to discuss those questions in whatever way you want to. Obviously, there won't be that classic kind of awkward feedback stuff at the end of it all, where one of you's nominated to do that. That will not happen. But the chat facility still remains there, in which comments and questions can be put to Madeleine and to Ruth. So I'll leave it over to the team now then to divide us into our rooms. Thank you very much, and see you again shortly.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm assuming that everybody has rejoined now, so we're back. It wasn't very long to kind of solve the whole problems of the world, but it was nice to be in the groups that we were in. And hope you've taken something out of that, and no doubt out of the excellent talk that Madeleine gave us earlier. But we've got a second great person speaking to us now. And I'm going to hand over to Canon Dr. Ruth Valerio, who is the Global Advocacy and Influencing Director at Tearfund, and also, of course, Canon Theologian at Rochester Cathedral. So welcome to Ruth, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry that took me so long. I wasn't able to unmute myself, so I was waiting to be unmuted. So thank you. Forgive the short pause there. So really lovely to be with you all today in this different way. I've made myself a cup of tea and a piece of toast just as we were starting, and I was saying to a few beforehand, how nice it is that we can do these things and I can make myself a cup of tea before joining a clergy conference. There was another conference that I was speaking at where I made myself breakfast during the first session, and as the final session was being wrapped up, I was able to get on and do lunch. And so there have been other meetings I've been a part of where I've been cleaning in the background, and this is I'm kind of quite enjoying this, but also of course missing being actually with you in person. And I know a few of us commented on this in the chat, but it really struck me at the beginning just how quiet we were, whereas a normal clergy day, I'm sure there would be a buzz of everybody seeing each other. So somehow we have to pretend that that is the kind of atmosphere that we are with, all of us enjoying seeing familiar faces on the screen and able to see each other in that way instead. So I've got a few things that I want to talk with you about today. And I'm actually going to ask, I was going to do my own presenting of PowerPoints, but I'm actually going to ask Ian if he would mind doing that for me, because I think I would probably find that simpler. And just wanted to start off with reflecting briefly on 3 things that have been shaken for us in this time. And Maddie, thank you for your excellent presentation earlier. I'm glad you're sending the notes around. It covered so many things and has given us a really helpful framework. So it was really detailed, and obviously I'm not going to go into all of the detail on that. But 3 things I think for us that have been shaken at this time: theology, ecclesiology, and missiology. Ian, is it possible to get it onto full, whatever it's called, presenter thing? I know, thanks. So 3 things being shaken. Our theology, I don't know if I'm the only one, but I have seen all sorts of different theological thinking whizzing around amongst my friends, but also on social media. Where is God in this? Who is God in this? Is this a judgment from God? What is God saying to us? Is this a sign of the end times? I'm sure you could add to that. It's been a challenge for us theologically. How do we make sense of what is happening at this time? I'm not going to go into that. I could do another whole talk on that. If you're, maybe I'll put a link up in the chat later. I've written a paper on a Christian perspective on COVID-19 that I hope might be helpful for you. But it's just to flag that our theology has been shaken. Our ecclesiology has been shaken. What does it mean to be church at this time? I know all of you will have had to adapt so quickly to doing things online. And in my little breakout group just now, we had a very quick conversation around communion and whether people have missed communion or not. I'm from a church background where it's not been an issue for us. We've continued sharing communion together, but doing that online. But I know for you, it's a very different situation, and I'm aware of all the debates that you've been having around that. So what does it mean to be church at this time? And going forwards, what will it mean to be church? And how will our churches and our expressions of church be shaken? And then missiology. How do we respond at this time? What should our response be? What should the church be doing at a time like this? We might say that our missiology hasn't changed. The church is always called to be the church, but we're in what for us is a unique situation. And how do we respond to that? So these 3 things are being shaken. And if we can go on to the next slide, Walter Brueggemann talks about this when he reflects on the Psalms. And he looks, this isn't unique to him, psychologists have gone through this and other people in different ways, but I like the way how Brueggemann places this and looks at this movement that happens in the Psalms. We start from a place of orientation in which everything makes sense in our lives and we know what is happening. Oh, hold on, I'm sorry, I've just lost my screen. Let me go back to full screen. And everything makes sense in our lives. And then through something like this pandemic, and I'm sure you can think of other personal examples in your life as well, we then hit a place of disorientation in which we feel like we've sunk into a pit. But then from that place of disorientation comes the opportunity for new orientation. And this is where we can be, in which we realize that God has lifted us out of the pit and we're in this new place. We may not feel that we're there yet. Just to say with the comment, yeah, we can share these PowerPoints with you afterwards. I haven't got notes, I'm afraid. I'm just speaking from the PowerPoint, but you can have the PowerPoint afterwards. So for us then, can we move out of this place of disorientation into a place of new orientation? That's one of the challenges for us. And how do we begin to approach this as Christians? What is our response? What should our response be at this time? And I've been reflecting on us being people of the cross and people of the resurrection, and holding those two things together. If we could have the next slide, Ian. I think it's really important that we don't rush to answers, but we sit with the questions. That can be one of our perennial problems, can't it? We want to find all the answers and we want to be making sense of everything. But I felt this really keenly, particularly over the Easter weekend, as the peak was building, and I had a colleague who lay in hospital battling for his life. And sadly, he actually died on Easter Day, which made for a very strange Easter Sunday. And as we went into Easter weekend, I heard Jesus' words to his disciples to watch and pray. And I knew I needed to do the same. And that is, I needed simply to sit with the unfolding national and personal tragedy, and not trying to rush around and put opinionated statements up on social media or come up with all the answers or make any grand posturing. But I needed to sit and to pray and to lament and to sit with that, to sit at the cross over Easter weekend. And I don't think that is only for Easter weekend. We are people of the cross, and I think we sit with that. But at the same time, we are people of the resurrection, and we're called to respond to the needs of our world. The same Lord who asks us to watch and pray also commissions us to be his witnesses in our localities and to the ends of the earth. And we believe that suffering and sickness is not what God has intended for his creation, and that our calling is to respond to people's needs and to live in ways that allow the wider natural world to flourish. And so part, I think, of being a Christian, of being a human, is to look forward. I think it's intrinsic to our human nature, is that desire to move through disorientation into a new orientation, if we're open and willing to embrace the possibilities. We are, as Christians, we are forward-looking people. Christianity is eschatology, as Jürgen Moltmann would say. It is hope, it is forward-looking, forward-moving. And the late Colin Gunton talked about how the Holy Spirit is God acting to bring creation to its perfection. And the work of the Holy Spirit is to direct the world to its end in the saving work of God. And so as human beings, whereas we are directed by the Spirit, part of that creation, so we also are pulled forward by the movement of the Spirit. We are beings in motion, I might say, picking up on Zizioulas, if you know his thinking around beings in communion. I think we are beings in motion. We have that urgency, that restlessness, I think, that is born of the Spirit, an inner restlessness to be wanting to move things forward to perfection, and a holy dissatisfaction with how things are, and a constant inner pull to be working for change and looking for a better future. And so we are people of the cross, and we are people of the resurrection. So if we can move on to the next slide. What sort of a world then do we want to build? Well, I believe that we have a unique opportunity here to build a better world together. We've been hearing about some of those shifts from Maddie. In our small group, we talked about some of those things as well. I'd love to have an opportunity to unpack it with you a bit more, maybe during the questions at the end. But we've seen shifts moving towards community. We've seen shifts around valuing life before economic productivity. We've seen that where we have the impetus, we actually can change and we can make a difference. We can respond when we see that sense of urgency. We can pull together. And so the opportunity and the potential there is there. And I've put up here the World Rebooted. This is a new campaign, a new thing that's been launched from Tearfund, and it consists of a paper for church discussion, and then a little short video and some thinking around what are those shifts that we have seen in our society. What are the inequalities that have been exposed, but also what are the potentials, what are the positive things that we have seen, and how can we build on those? What are some specific things that we could do to love our neighbour, both near and far, to protect the vulnerable? And part of central to all of this is rebooting the economy in a fairer and more sustainable way. And there's a whole load of thinking being done by all sorts, all around the place, including Tearfund, looking at how can we reboot the economy in a fairer and sustainable way. So then moving on, what about for us? Where do we go from here? Let me just touch on this really briefly. Individual action. Partly it's up to us. If we've been enjoying the lack of pollution and we've been enjoying no cars on the road, well, are we going to get back in our cars? We're the ones who drive. If we've been enjoying looking out at the skies and not seeing the airplane trails going through our skies, if we've been enjoying being at home and not having to do all of that travelling, it's up to us, isn't it? Are we going to get back into our airplanes once we're able to do so? Or are we prepared to make some harder decisions? But of course we know that it's not that simple, and so often our decisions are kind of dictated to us by the bigger systems. And so we want to use our voices as well. And one of the things that we're doing as Tearfund is we're asking people to contact Boris Johnson, to send him an email and to ask him, as he with his cabinet are looking at rebooting the economy, to put together an economic stimulus package that works along more just, fairer, sustainable lines. And again, I'll put a link up in the chat afterwards and you can see that. And our churches, we have such a role to play in our churches. I think we've been really good in how we've responded in our churches, as we do. We've done what the church does best, and we've been there to help and to respond in our communities. I also think there is more that we can do around speaking out about some of these broader issues of justice and sustainability. So I've been part of some discussions with church leaders, and I've watched webinars with different leaders in the UK where they've talked about what are the opportunities of the pandemic. And it's been about the opportunities for doing things online, for introducing people to Jesus, breaking down the walls and so on, all of which is absolutely right, and we want to seize that. I don't know that I've heard anyone talk about the opportunities to reset our relationship with God's creation and with our global neighbours. And it's time as church that we bring those issues into the centre as part of a holistic gospel and use this opportunity. Let's not miss it. And then in our own churches, why not use the Tearfund's Reboot campaign as a way of getting that discussion into your church? So we've put together a little discussion packet that you could do in your small groups or on a Sunday as a way of getting your church engaged. So I want to finish with this quote, if I can have the final slide, by Catholic theologian Peter Hocken. I realised recently, with a constant battle inside of me. On the one hand, I'm forever hopeful of the possibilities of building a better world, that we can work together, we must work together to see this become a reality. And I'm constantly, you know, pushing myself and pushing others. We've got to do this. This is an opportunity. Let's seize it. On the other hand, I have a very sober and realistic assessment of the human condition and the very present reality of sin. And this is the tension, isn't it, of living with that overlapping of the ages. As we experience the first fruit of the Spirit, like a seal or a deposit that guarantees our inheritance and pulls us forward, but we know that we won't see all that we long for until Christ returns. And so this quote from Peter Hocken for me really describes it beautifully. I feel that stretch, and it's painful and it's difficult. But as followers of Jesus, we are called to navigate that tension and to live faithfully, to live lives that speak of God's hope for creation. And we may feel overwhelmed by the tragedies that are around us. But part of being spirit-filled, forward-looking people is that we don't give up. And we remember that assurance in 1 Corinthians 15, that our labour in the Lord is not in vain. Hey, I'm going to pause there. Thank you. I hope that was helpful. There's so much more that could be gone into on all of that, but I shall pause and breathe.
Ruth, thank you so much for giving us some deep reflections on faith and theology, looking at questions of personal and corporate reorientation, rebooting of creation, justice, sustainability and hope. I wrote down a whole load of things, which shows how much ground you've covered actually in the last 15 to 20 minutes. So we're really grateful to you for that. We're going to break into our digital rooms again, and I think you'll find that they could be different this time round, for better or for worse, or maybe just for the same. The questions are in front of you. Maybe scribble them down. I think Jenny will be able to share them while you're in the rooms as well. But basically, what struck you most about what Ruth has just said? And where is it relevant for your church? And what could you do to respond? So we'll take a break for 15 minutes doing that and then come back for some plenary questions and answers. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. I think you're all back in the room now. Firstly, unless my experience was a complete freak, a random freak, you ended up in the same digital room as you did in the first instances. Sorry, I didn't realise about that one, but I'm sure it worked for everybody really well. And we've had some time to discuss these issues. And also now you're just getting the opportunity to put up on screen, if you like, the questions that you might want to ask Ruth and Maddie in the remaining time that we've got here, just a few minutes now. But there was one came in quite early on, actually, I seem to remember, from Peter, which I think was for Maddie, because you talked, Maddie, about communitarianism, and I think the question was that a specific reference to Amitai et Sioni, or to a more general understanding of communitarianism? So if you're able to speak to that, perhaps without disappearing down a philosophical hole for the rest of us, that would be great. Thank you.
No, I can speak to it very quickly without disappearing down a philosophical hole. I'm not making a specific reference there. I'm just talking about often people's political views being put along a spectrum of, at one end, individualism, and at the other end, communitarianism. And then there is also the liberal versus authoritarian, and they're a little bit different, but broadly related, i.e., to what extent are the rights and desires of the individual, is society set up to privilege those and to let those free, or is it about the community as the focus of our decision making and our policy, basically? So I think we have potentially moved slightly towards authoritarian in our policing, but also towards communitarian, just by seeing how starkly one person's actions obviously directly affects the group, and how obvious it is that health is a common good. Obviously, leaving value judgment on that aside, of course, there are also questions there about how political developments play into that, and if we are moving down that road, and there is a separate backlash against liberal values, which I suppose we will see how deeply entrenched that is, or a sort of moment of reckoning on some of those structural inequalities, then all of those things basically tie into both of those, left, right. That's unhelpful. They're not left, right. One side to the other side swings.
Thanks very much, Manuel. That's great. I'm still waiting for a few questions to come in, so he's playing for time here.
Simon, well, can I help you play for time? I've just explained some of the links that I've put
Yeah,
up.
please do, absolutely.
So there are a few, and because they all went, I thought they might be separated, but they all look a bit messy. So the first one that you can see, Tearfund.org about you action, the world rebooted. That is the main, if you want to have a look at the world rebooted, if you click on that, that will take you through to the main page, and you'll see the little animation and the discussion, the paper that we've put together, and the discussion there for churches as well. So that's, and then you can click on the links and see more within that. Then the links underneath, the first one takes you through to the paper that I wrote on a Christian perspective on COVID-19. It's a lot shorter than Tom Wright's book. It doesn't go into the depth that he does, very deliberately, because actually this came from our partners at Tearfund and church leaders who were getting suddenly bombarded with all sorts of questions around, this is a judgment from God, we should be welcoming it, we shouldn't be responding, we shouldn't be helping. And our supporters were writing in and saying, what do you think about this? So it's a very deliberately short paper written on that, which I hope might be helpful. It's now been translated into a whole number of different languages, including Arabic, and has gone all around the world. So I hope that might be helpful. And then the second link takes you through to a deeper policy paper. So it looks at the policy things underneath the more popular level, World Rebooted, if you want to read a bit more about that. It's more focused, as you would expect from Tearfund, on global poverty than social poverty, than domestic poverty, though I'm currently writing a Grove booklet and I'm looking at that a little bit, but it's great to hear that Theos, that's an ongoing project for them as well. And then the final ones, you can see 3 ones that start with HTTPS. The final one is, if you want right now to send Boris Johnson a message, then click on that and you can do so. So those are the different links, which I hope will be helpful for you and give you some more resources.
Thanks ever so much. We really appreciate that one. The questions are now piling in, actually. We've only got just a few minutes left, and I'm trying to sort of assimilate them and draw them together if I can. I mean, the first one was really from Alan. Does the desire to see society rebooted have to have a strong political voice and political engagement? I don't know whether either of you want to speak to that, Ruth or Maddie.
Well, I can start.
Yeah, I mean, I have thoughts on it, but you go.
Okay. So I think it does, because our society is governed by our political structures, and if we're going to see change, then the large scale systemic change is brought about through that way. But I also don't think it's only about speaking into the political sphere. It's partly about businesses as well. Our companies are so influential and we need to see change there. But of course, it's also about our own social change too, and the community level involvement. So it's individual, community, political and businesses all working together.
Yeah, I think I would just only add, I completely agree with everything there. I would only add that I feel like politics is the vehicle through which lots of change ultimately happens, but it's quite far downstream. And I think one of the things which we just won't change any of this stuff without is probably basically a kind of spiritual and moral revolution. And I do basically think we need to change our values, and not we here particularly, but society at large has a values issue as well, and the church obviously can be right at the front of that conversation, but it is so much easier to change your behaviour if you really, it's like Augustine talking about an intellectual change versus a change of the will, and actually things are not sustainable unless there is a change of the will, I would say.
Thank you very much, both of you. I do want to say to Jenny, I've lost the cursor on my screen, so I'm losing the questions as they scroll up the screen. So if you just pull out one or two now, while I just tell everybody here that we said we'd wrap up about 12:30. There are one or two questions. That's fine. She's got a parcel arrived or something like that. There are one or two questions that people may have, we may have space to address, and I think we can go on for a few minutes longer. I appreciate that some of you will want to actually leave because you've got other stuff to do. But we have a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes more, if that's okay, still for Maddie and for Ruth to be engaged still. Well, you might be with us still for 10 more minutes, maybe, Ruth, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine.
So I realise some may need to go now, in which case, thank you very much. It's great to have you. I just want to tell you that we're going to run a second diocesan Zoom conference on Thursday, the 16th of July at 11 o'clock on trauma-informed ministry for these times, led by the Reverend Dr. Carla Grosh-Miller and the Reverend Hilary Eisen of the Tragedies and Congregations team. The first session with Hilary will cover information about trauma in the individual, and the second session with Carla will look at collective trauma and congregations, especially in the context of the pandemic, and there will be opportunities to ask questions and share experiences. We will share those details with you, so don't worry if you haven't got them immediately to hand. You'll be hearing from us in due course on that, but that also should be a really good session. So for those of you who are able to remain, if I may just pass over to Jenny for the moment while I try to retrieve my cursor, just to relay one or two of those questions to our two speakers. Thank you.
Okay, well, there has been a bit of a theme coming through about the kind of overwhelming nature of all of this. So Trudy's asked, this all seems overwhelming and huge, and she's left with the question, how do we respond, in the sense of where do we even start to respond? And sort of tied into that was a question earlier from Jennifer about the fact that, almost how do you get the balance right as well in the response? They've done quite a lot of pastoral support groups, and that's been effective, but how can we be sure that when we go back to whatever normality we do, we're not just focused entirely on pastoral support, but don't miss the broader mission? So this kind of whole balance question, have you any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, so I think it's broadening it out rather than one or the other, and was why I really wanted to say clearly when I spoke earlier that as a church, I think we have responded really well. We have done what we do as church. We've got stuck into our community's needs, both practically and also responding with the grief and the pastoral support and that side of things too. And it's an encouragement to broaden that out and see that being church is about more than that, as important as those things are. And to answer so I'm just going to skim up to Trudy. I would really say just get hold of that World Rebooted material, because it is there in order to help church engagement. So it has been broken down. It's got some simple things that you can do together in your church. There's that one very simple, straightforward action of contacting Boris Johnson. And then there are other things that we can be doing too, thinking about our individual responses. You know, we could all just make one choice. What is something from this period that has been really beneficial that I don't want to lose? Maybe it's that being at home more has meant that at the weekends we've gone out for a family bike ride together, which we wouldn't have done before, because before half of us would have been in the shops or would have been doing the other things that we're used to being distracted with. Maybe as a family we can decide we're going to keep that. You know, there might be just one thing that you could decide you're going to keep and you're going to continue to do differently afterwards, and maybe that might be something for your church as well. So there are small steps that you can take, and I hope that the World Rebooted would help you with that. And of course there are other resources as well. The Eco Church is a great resource for really practical things for your church, and if you want to look at some of those lifestyle things, then some of the books that I've written have got more detail in there as well. But I know I'm in danger of beginning to overwhelm you by giving more things, so I shan't say more than that.
Yeah, I think I would just, I mean, also I'm not in an immediate church context, so I don't want to sound like I'm giving you advice as it were, because I'm obviously not qualified to do that. But what I would say is just out of empathy there, that certainly at Theos, I think our immediate reaction was, you know, gosh, we need to respond to everything that's changing. Like, let's have a crisis management meeting. Like, you know, what topics are going to be more important? You know, everything needs to be sorted right now. And then realizing actually that, you know, pandemics, probably none of us really had an emotional reaction to what a pandemic meant 6 months ago. And for me now, I just feel like it just sounds noisy. Pandemic means lots of overwhelming noise and not really being quite sure how to respond to that. And I think the more that we've gone through that, it has been a bit of an emotional journey, and none of us really know where it's going to land. I think possibly not just immediately trying to change everything is just as good a response as any other. And obviously some things have inevitably had to change, and I know that you've, you know, all had to close buildings and things, but I do wonder if it's the sort of watch and pray thing, isn't it? That there is also it's perfectly reasonable to wait a bit and see you know, what needs to be done. The other side, of course, of that is that there is immediate need right in front of us all, and in that sense I think that's about just being in touch with your local community, isn't it, and understanding what they immediately need. But yeah, all of that is just to say that I sympathise with that. and yes, it is very overwhelming, but I do think that we should, all of us in society, not all of us here particularly, but all of us should be kinder on ourselves, not to feel that we need to have an immediate response. Watch and pray.
Thank you very much for that wisdom from both of you. I think we may just move to one final question, given that Bishop James is yet to speak also, and I don't want to lose too many participants. But I think it's just a question about how we harness the energy and optimism and the vision, actually, of young people in some of our about the future, because, well, we all know that the millennials will be heading into a second recession after the start of their working careers, and it's going to be a big challenge for young people what lies ahead. But nevertheless, they have so much, not just to teach us, but to contribute towards a better society. So I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
I would just say on that the sort of millennials obviously are quite difficult to understand spiritually, just from a sort of research point of view, because they're quite creative spiritually and therefore are not bound. You know, lots of them have not been raised with faith, and it's good not to assume that people necessarily understand Bible stories, for example, because obviously that's no longer true. However, I think that they also are less hostile than maybe the generation above, and I guess millennials is not the youngest generation anymore either. So the ones coming through, the Gen Z, are even more so. I think that it probably has been a good thing for the church to be forced to try out digital engagement more than it had before, and maybe we, maybe there are openings there, I think.
So I've got two daughters who are in my vicinity. You may have seen them coming in and out of camera shot at different times. One is 16 and one is 20, and they are both really switched on to these issues, really passionate, and particularly these last few days or last few weeks, we've become such a politicised household with Black Lives Matters and all the issues that has raised as well. But the environmental stuff, they're really switched on to that and engaged. And I've actually seen one of them certainly walk away from church, and don't know quite whether I want to say walk away from faith, but walk away from church because the church that she was going to was not engaging with these issues. So she would get so fed up of her youth group leader every week saying, you've got to be sold out for Christ, sold out for Jesus and whatever. And she'd come back saying, yes, I know, I am. Now I want to talk about, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? How do I live that out with these different passions that I've got? So I think there is so much energy, and we mustn't think that if we talk about these things, we mustn't see a split and think that talking about issues of sustainability and poverty and racial justice are separate from our Christian faith. We need to help our young people and show our young people how they are an integrated part and ask them to lead. So I know a few churches that have taken on Eco Church, and they've asked their youth group to lead on that and to be the ones to do that.
Can I just very, very quickly add to that, because I'm not an Anglican, I'm a Quaker, and I'm on the national, I've been reminded that I'm not on the national committee for getting more young adult Quakers involved, and that's a really massive part of it and has been really successful. One of our more successful initiatives was about giving people responsibility, because then they feel obviously valued. So yeah, just add that.
Thank you, Ruth and Madeleine, thank you so much. I mean, there's no question what we need coming out of this are people who think deeply around these issues. I'm really blessed today to have two people who are clearly thinking in very profound ways around this topic and have given us their time. I really appreciate that. On the bar below, you have the reactions. Maybe we could, rather than just unmuting you, just to digitally show our appreciation and thanks for all that Ruth and Madeleine have given to us today. Been much appreciated, and I know that you'll be able to give us copies of PowerPoints and texts in various cases, but do appreciate your engagement so much. And I'm going to hand over now, if I may, to Bishop James. Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you, Bishop Simon. And I add my thanks to those you've already given, to Maddie and to Ruth, and to those, can I add my thanks to you, Simon, for convening us, and to Jenny and Ian and Katharina and others who've been, as it were, lurking behind the scenes, making this technically possible. I did notice a lot of really interesting comments in the chat as we went through, as well as some of the references to publications and things like that. And I'm hoping, Jenny, that somehow technologically, we can capture some of that. You're nodding, yes, good. After we go offline and perhaps circulate some of those links to people and such like. So some really interesting stuff there. It would be invidious of me to try and sort of summarize things, because we've been in all sorts of rich directions. But it did just one thought, which actually both Maddie and Ruth referred to in different ways. Is this sort of sense that there is a reflectiveness around, at least in some circles, and the encouragement to us not to rush to conclusions and to be ready to live with uncertainty. Ruth, some of what you were talking about in your references to Brueggemann and the Psalms, and that kind of deliberative process through from one phase to another in responding to things, orientation, disorientation, new orientation, that takes time, it takes reflection. And Maddie, you were talking about people's desire for the offering of space and reflective space and so forth. And it has struck me that both in government and church, in some circles at least, there has been a tendency to jump towards, wanting to direct things and control things. And so, we get these multiple iterations of new government guidance on A, B, C, or D, which changes every 10 minutes as they suddenly think about some different aspect, and that kind of desire to control. And I have to confess, don't quote me too widely on this, I realize I'm being recorded. One has seen the sort of command and control response in one or two of my Episcopal colleagues around the country who are wanting to sort of micromanage things in their dioceses, as I perceive it. And you've given us a really helpful counterpoint to some of that, and something about that rebooting, that resettling of the world into new patterns, and us being open to that for ourselves, and the church being open to that for herself, and as something which we perhaps are able to offer to the wider world as well. So thank you hugely for all of that. Perhaps we might just close with prayer, and I'll use the prayer which is in prayer during the day for today, as we seek the wisdom of God and the light of God in discerning the shape of our calling in these days and for days to come. Eternal light, shine into our hearts. Eternal goodness, deliver us from evil. Eternal power, be our support. Eternal wisdom, scatter the darkness of ignorance. Eternal pity, have mercy upon us, that with all our heart and mind and soul and strength, we may seek your face and be brought by your infinite mercy to your holy presence. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So may God bless us in all of our working and our waiting. Amen.